Hi, I'm Gill Holden, Principal Officer of the Early Childhood Unit at the National Children's Bureau. I'm following on from a brilliantly successful Infant Mental Health Awareness Week last week. I'm really pleased to be joined by Sally Hogg from the Parent Infant Foundation to talk to me today and reflect on infant mental health. Sally, thank you so much for giving up your time today and joining me.
It's lovely to talk to you.
Oh, thank you. So before we sort of get into what to talk about today, I wonder if you could just give us a brief introduction to yourself and tell us a little bit about your role.
Yeah, so I'm Sally Hogg. I'm the Deputy CEO at the Parent Infant Foundation. We are a small but powerful national charity, and we focus specifically on support for the earliest relationships between babies and their parents. And we do that in two ways. So we support specialised parent-infant relationship teams, or what you might know as specialist infant mental health services around the country. And we work with those people who want to set those services up. But we also have a big campaigning and policy presence, which is about making people aware of the importance of early relationships and infant mental health and advocating for the services that babies and their families need.
Brilliant, vital work there, Sally. So yeah, thank you very much indeed. So can we start off? Will you tell me a little bit about what is early trauma?
Yeah, so early trauma was the theme of this year's Infant Mental Health Awareness Week. And early trauma is when babies experience psychological trauma as a result of feeling unsafe and high levels of stress that are prolonged and worries about the safety of themselves and their parents. So what we wanted to talk about, we talk about obviously Infant Mental Health Awareness Week is all around the importance of early experiences and early social and emotional wellbeing and development. What we wanted to do by talking about early trauma is to focus attention on those babies where things are going wrong, where they're experiencing adversity in their lives, which is actually leading to them being stressed and distressed for prolonged periods and for high levels in a way that might affect their early development if we don't get the right support in place.
Brilliant, thank you. And can you tell us a little bit more about why we feel it's important that our early years professionals and early years sector really understand this and what they can perhaps do to be able to support?
Yeah, so I think there's two really important things we need to be talking about. One is how do we prevent babies from experiencing psychological trauma and problems in their developing mental health. So as early years professionals, we can all play a role in both reducing the adversity facing families and supporting the early relationships, which you know are an incredibly important protective thing for babies and their families. So we do that through our direct work with families, but also by identifying families that are struggling and making sure that they get specialist support. So that might be about identifying families where mums and dads are struggling with severe poverty, housing problems, domestic violence, mental health problems, where actually we need to flag up to health visitors or GPs or others that this family needs extra support. And we can also really support parents in providing babies with that safe, nurturing, responsive care that's so important. So everybody working with families in the early years can do something to identify and make sure families get the support. But also, I think some people listening to this might think, well, I work in a nursery and I know families need the support, but what can I do about it? A really important thing you can do is also be a champion for this. We see a lot in the press about this kind of teenage mental health crisis and lot of people talking about eating disorders and self-harm, and that drives behaviour. We need similar amount of discussion and debate about our young children who are experiencing mental health problems and getting the support they need. So you can help families get that support and you can be a champion for it. But then there's a really important role that early years professionals can play when babies have experienced that early trauma, and if you're dealing with children in your setting. Part of that is being trauma informed and trauma aware in your work. So there's this really important concept that we think about when we're working trauma, which is moving away from what's wrong with you to what happened to you. So if you're seeing a child in a setting who is acting out in different ways, or maybe very withdrawn, maybe they are quick to flare up into anger, maybe they really don't trust adults or they're avoidant of relationships with adults in the setting. If you see those sorts of behaviours, have that mindset of why is that child behaving like that? And what's gone on in their lives and how can I help prepare that? So actually we need to move away from an idea that some children kind of have a deficit or a damage, to actually some children have adapted in very reasonable ways to the experiences that they've had in their early life. If you've lived in a household where there haven't been adults who respond to your needs and provide safe, nurturing care, and actually those adults maybe have been hostile or have been scary, you're going to have learned that you can't, not to trust adults, or that you can't get that rewarding care from adults. Or you might have learned that actually you need to be really clingy to adults because you can't trust them to come to you when you need them, so you have to cling on tight. That's really kind of adaptive evolutionary responses to early trauma. And so when you see those behaviours in children, it's really important to think, well, what's gone on and how can I help heal this? If this child has not learned to trust adults, how can I, as their key worker, perhaps be that sensitive, responsive adult and start to change what they expect of relationships and what they expect of adults? So understanding early trauma, understanding behaviours in light of that, and thinking about how do you repair and help these children to heal is so important. And actually really foundation, it's probably the most important thing you can do in their lives. But if a child can't just feel safe and secure and trust other people and have good relationships, they're not going to thrive in every stage of their lives going on. So we've got to reset those things if we've got children in our care who need that support. And that stuff, again, it's stuff you can do really importantly in the setting, in every interaction you have them. You can also make sure that they are getting the referrals they need for additional support from the rest of the system, which might be mental health support, parent-infant relationship support. It might be about getting additional support for the family from health visiting or other services.
Great, thank you. These excuse me, these conversations with parents can be quite difficult, I assume, to sort of start off a conversation for an early years professional, starting that conversation with a parent. Have you any tips about how practitioners might have a conversation with parents about trying to support their baby or child's infant mental health?
I think we can do a lot through modelling how we talk about children to parents. So really, one of the most important things in terms of infant mental health is ensuring the adults around a child think of that child as an individual person with their own mind, their own experiences, and try and tune in and respond to that. And professionals can model that, even with tiny babies, about talking for the baby. This little, she seems very upset today. Do we understand? We've been trying to understand why she might be feeling so distressed. Do you know anything? Is anything happening at home? So really just bringing into the conversation the concept of this small person who is responding to the world around them, because we know sadly that there are still people who believe that actually babies, they're not affected by the world around them. Then they don't have thoughts or feelings or emotions yet. That will come later, and actually it doesn't really matter what happens to them in the first couple of years of life because they'll never remember it. So as practitioners, we can just bring that baby as a person into the conversation and model that really compassionate, reflective way of thinking about babies. And just wonder together with the parent what's going on. This 2-year-old who came in today, has got very cross with things that's going on, and we're trying to help him through that. We're doing these things to help him through that, and we're wondering why he seems to be getting so cross. What might be going on in his life that means he's getting cross with other children? What might he be feeling or thinking or have experienced? And wondering with the parent and giving the parent the permission to think about actually what's going on for their child and what support they might need. And also I think it's really important to be clear that no one gets this right all the time. We're not expecting parents to be perfect, and also parents shouldn't feel bad if things are going wrong for their child. Actually, there's no stigma or shame, but parents can play a really important role in getting it right again and getting things back on track. And so having conversations in that light about actually not what's going wrong for this child that parents need to feel bad about, but how can we understand this child together and understand together what support they need and work as a partnership between the parent and the earlier setting and anyone else to really get things right for this child.
Brilliant, thank you. And I think that partnership with parents is just so key for the early years professionals being able to support children the best they can, and also impacts on that home learning environment as well, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, the concept of home learning environment is a really interesting one, I think, because there are lots of professionals who think about what goes on between a parent and a baby, or a parent and a toddler. And in education, we call that home learning environment, and in mental health, we call that an early relationship, and you know, in different bits of the system, it's called different things, but everybody's thinking about actually all this. A home learning environment is what's going on between the adults in the child's life and the child, and what's the environment in which they are developing in lots of ways, not just learning academically, but developing. And I think, you know, we need to appreciate that environment around the child, the relationships in that environment and the way parents are with their child is probably the most important thing. You know, a home learning environment isn't just what toys have you got to play with, or, you know, have you got some crayons to practice mark making. It's what's happening in your relationships. That's the bit. And so it's really important that we support early relationships and we work with parents. And I think one of the things, you know, I've been in education policy for a very long time now, and we've been talking, you know, back in the Every Child Matters days, parenting was a really big bit of education then, and we were thinking, how do we work in partnerships with parents? And I think one of the many sad things that happened in the pandemic is that those relationships and that kind of working with parents as co-educators, as people with that shared interest and contribution to children's development has really broken down. And in some settings, we're still seeing, you know, the parents left outside the door. And that might feel in some ways easier for a setting and less disruptive for children, but actually it's really missing a chance to understand what's happening in children's lives, to understand how we can best support them, and to work with parents as partners. So however more inconvenient it might be to get the parents back, you know, through the door and talk to them and kind of work with them, it's one of the most important things that settings can be doing, because we know it's parents and those early relationships that are going to be the most important factor for children's development.
Absolutely, yeah, that's there. Thank you. So I know you've recently brought out some research, launched as part of the Infant Mental Health Awareness Week last week. Is there anything else in that you think is really useful for us to highlight to the early years sector?
So it shows actually that we were quite pleasantly surprised by, so we did some research with the public, and the proportion of people that really understand themselves that early relationships matter and early trauma matters. So I think there's quite a positive message there that actually the general public, and obviously that means parents as well, understand the importance of the early years, and so probably are quite receptive to conversations about that and keen to think about what they can do. So I think that shows that early years professionals are probably pushing a bit on an open door if they do want to start exploring that with families. There is lots of messages there from early years professionals themselves telling us the impact that they see in their settings of children who've experienced trauma, and we will be using that to campaign for that support to be there. There are also lots of messages from teachers and early years professionals who talk about the fact that they don't cover things like infant mental health, early trauma and early relationships in their training pre-qualification. And so if you're a manager of a setting or somebody who thinks about continued professional development, then it knows actually what can we do with our workforce to plug some of those gaps and to become a trauma-informed setting, and to have this understanding and this language about early development that gives us more in our toolbox to think about how do we best support the kids in our care.
Brilliant, thank you. And I know, excuse me, as part of the Help for Early Years Providers website, the DFE have recently put up, there's going to be some information in there on in the child development training about early science and things as well. So that's really great to be able to direct practitioners to be able to look at that also.
Yeah, and I would also give a plug to Anna Freud's Early Years in Mind resources. So they obviously come, the Anna Freud Centre has a history of working in mental health and early relationships, and they've done work for early years professionals with that, you know, that background and that philosophy informing what they do. So there's increasing amounts of stuff up there. And there's also the UK Trauma Council, which is not resources specifically for early years professionals, but really beautiful explanations of the science, and some lovely examples there of there's some animations of older children and kind of who might act out, you know, so might respond badly or maybe kind of hit another child or something because they've got this heightened flight or fight response because of their trauma, and then how then, you know, if teachers don't respond to that in a helpful way, it exacerbates the problem for that child, and actually how we respond to those what might have previously been perceived as kind of bad behaviours, if we perceive them as responses to early trauma and we see them in that light and respond to them that way, then we can actually take things on a virtuous cycle rather than a vicious cycle.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that's really important to sort of really look at how we reframe things when particularly when we're seeing these behaviours that sometimes we find quite difficult, particularly within early years settings, sometimes to reframe those to show that actually that's a child communicating their distress. So yeah, really important. Thank you.
Yeah, well, the science of early trauma has this concept of social thinning, which is if you've experienced early trauma, so you've got various vulnerabilities and hardships, adversity in your life, and then you experience early trauma and your brain and body respond to that. So things like you've got a heightened flight or a flight response, you overreact to things, you don't trust people in the same way. All of those very kind of reasonable responses that I talked about earlier, but that can then impair your relationships as your life goes on. So it's harder to make friends, it's harder to keep friends, it's harder to have a good relationship with your teacher or your key worker or other adults in your life because of all of that how the trauma has affected you. But that means that as children go through life, they don't build the same social networks and social capital that other children will build. And so you see that kind of cumulative disadvantage, because we know that good friendships, good relationships, having, you know, with our peers and with adults is so important for children to be able to take advantage of lots of other things in their life. And so actually helping children who've experienced early trauma to have good relationships and to overcome the impact of that is really important. And if we don't, that's yet another adversity they face, and they've not just had the trauma, but they've also not got these peer networks, which is so important.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Okay, thank you so much. That's been so interesting. Is there anything else that you'd like to add, or anything else you feel is really useful to share with the early years providers?
It might be helpful for me to talk a little bit about specialist parent-infant relationship teams, which I mentioned at the start, are kind of core to our work at the Parent-Infant Foundation. So these teams are multidisciplinary teams, but always led by a mental health professional, so a psychologist or a psychotherapist. And they do two things. They work directly with families where there are risks and issues in early relationships to help to repair some of those problems and to help parents to provide babies with the nurturing care that they need. And parent-infant teams also act as kind of experts and champions in their local system. So they'll often offer training to other professionals, reflective spaces, a chance for kind of consultation. So if you're worried about a child, you can talk through actually how might we as an early years setting cope with this child, and how might we best support them. You can get that information and advice. So and parent relationship teams is our kind of national name for them, but they often have very different names on the ground. They might be called an attachment service or a PIP, or often they've got a name that they've just created locally with local families. I would really encourage, if you're working in early years services, to find out whether there is a team in your area. You could look at the Parent-Infant Foundation website. We've got a map of the teams that exist, because if there is one, there is a source of expertise and training and support there that you can draw as professionals, and you can also think about referring families to if that's required. You know, you can do things directly with families, but actually you really, as somebody who works in the early years, you know, try and be a champion as well, because babies don't have a voice, and when they're experiencing stress and distress, it's not often known about and it's not affecting other people in the system. So we really need everybody who knows what's going on for babies to be a champion and to shout out for the support that children need.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Sally. That's been so interesting. And yeah, a big shout out to early years providers to champion the needs of very small children. So thank you very much indeed for your time. That's been really useful.
It's lovely to talk to you, Jill.